You think this is a game? This is my career!
Glass flashed like a blade when the boardroom door swung shut. The table stretched long and heavy, polished so bright it looked like another room trapped beneath its surface. A wall of glass opened to the city skyline. The air was too still, broken only by the tick of a clock that sounded louder than it should have. Linda Carter stood at the head of the table, her white blazer sharp as a warning. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Her eyes moved across the room until they landed on Marcus Johnson. He sat quietly, hands folded, posture calm, gaze unshaken. Around him, directors shifted in their leather chairs. Papers rustled, but no one spoke. "Before we begin," Linda said, voice cutting the silence, "we must address a problem." She lifted a folder, its edges crisp, and placed it in front of Marcus as if laying down a charge. "This board has no room for unqualified advisors. Standards matter. Reputation matters. And some people," her pause carried the weight of an insult unspoken, "simply don't belong here." The words echoed against glass walls. They did not vanish. They stayed, clinging to the polished surface, to the director's nervous glances, to the steady silence of the man at the center of it. No one corrected her. No one reminded her who Marcus was. It was easier to bow their heads, to let the clock keep ticking, to pretend this was only routine. Marcus did not move. His stillness was not weakness. It was discipline. A shield honed by years of knowing when silence spoke louder than words. His calm presence filled the space more than her voice did, but Linda pressed harder. She leaned closer, hands flat on the glass. "We can resolve this quickly," she said. "Security is available. If you leave quietly now, this doesn't have to be embarrassing." The contrast was sharp, her sharp heels clicking against marble, her voice carrying over the table like steel. Against his calm gaze, his folded hands, his silence, she mistook quiet for surrender. The boardroom held its breath. The directors turned pages they didn't read. A pen rolled and stopped at the edge of the table. The glass walls reflected two figures, one standing trying to dominate, the other seated, holding steady. At last, Linda's words landed fully in the silence. They hovered in the air, heavy as smoke, impossible to ignore. Marcus finally lifted his eyes from the folder to meet hers. He had not spoken a single word, yet the entire room leaned forward, waiting. Her words still echoed, sharp, final, humiliating, yet unanswered. And in that moment, the silence became unbearable. Close, her words hung in the glass chamber, echoing with no reply as the room waited for his answer. The folder lay unopened before him, but Marcus Johnson did not reach for it. He sat with the patience of a man who had carried heavier burdens than insults. His silence was not surrender. It was the weight of memory, of lessons earned through storms that none of the polished figures around him had ever faced. Marcus Johnson was no stranger to misunderstanding. The woman who tried to push him aside, Linda Carter, saw only what she wanted. A quiet man with dark skin and no name she cared to know. She mistook stillness for weakness and silence for absence. What she did not know, what the room itself seemed to forget, was that Marcus had built more than a place at the table. He had built the table itself. Years before, he had started with nothing but grit and the guidance of his grandmother, who told him that knowledge is wealth and dignity is armor. He had listened. He studied late nights under street lamps, read business journals borrowed from libraries, and worked in warehouses where the air smelled of dust and iron. He rose not through inheritance but through vision, turning small ventures into bold companies, and bold companies into a global conglomerate that shaped industries from technology to finance. The irony was sharp. Linda's arrogance grew from titles handed down, not earned. She had stepped into rooms already built, while Marcus had carved his own doors. She flaunted connections. He carried endurance. She spoke loudly. He moved steadily. Their contrast was stark, yet invisible to those who measured worth only by appearance. The directors shifted uncomfortably. Some recognized him, but fear kept their lips sealed. Others knew his story, but underestimated his resolve. To them, his humility was disarming, too soft for the brutal edge of corporate politics. They did not see that humility was his strength, a discipline forged by fire. Marcus sat still, but his very presence unsettled the silence. His calm posture, his unshaken eyes, were not the signs of a man being dismissed. They were the signs of a man waiting, watching, weighing. Linda mistook that watchfulness for hesitation. Her words grew sharper, her tone more cutting, as though repetition could turn assumptions into truth. Yet every word she spoke revealed her blindness. She saw only what was on the surface: his quiet, his folded hands, his lack of reaction. What she missed was the history inside him, the trials that had refined him into steel. The glass walls reflected their figures: Linda standing tall, posture proud, and Marcus seated, still as stone. But in truth, power rested in the one who did not need to move. The contrast between them became the unspoken tension in the room. Noise against silence, arrogance against humility, assumption against truth. When Marcus finally lifted his hand and closed the folder she had placed in front of him, it was not a sign of defeat. It was a signal that he chose the time of response, not her. The clock ticked on, each second marking the widening gap between what she thought she saw and who he really was. The room leaned forward, waiting. The story of Marcus Johnson was no secret, yet it was hidden in plain sight. The irony pressed heavy. The woman who thought she controlled the room was blind to the fact that the room itself bore the fingerprints of the man she tried to erase. Close. Sometimes the most powerful man in the room is the one most easily overlooked. The silence of the boardroom had weight, but Marcus had carried heavier silences before. He had grown up in a neighborhood divided by invisible lines, streets where opportunity stopped and struggle began. The buildings were old, their paint chipped, their windows rattling in the wind. Yet inside one small home, a grandmother's voice carried wisdom stronger than the walls around them. "Knowledge is wealth, and dignity is armor," she would tell him. She had little money to give, but her words became treasures. She reminded him that silence was not emptiness, it was discipline. When others spoke to cut him down, silence could hold him upright. As a boy, Marcus walked past stores he could not afford to enter. He lingered at the library, borrowing business books with worn covers, pages underlined by hands before his. He studied them late at night under the dim glow of a borrowed lamp, memorizing not just numbers but principles, honor in deals, strength in patience, vision in small beginnings. His first business was nothing more than a few crates of goods sold on a street corner. He saved carefully, reinvested, and worked through setbacks that would have crushed others. He carried boxes, swept floors, and counted change with hands that never trembled. While others doubted, he built step by step, turning corners into stores and stores into companies. The contrast was sharp. Around him, people lost hope under the weight of poverty. But Marcus treated hardship as a teacher. Where others saw broken streets, he saw lessons in resilience. Where others gave in to bitterness, he chose endurance. His grandmother's voice stayed with him like a compass. Never let them mistake your silence for weakness. That silence became his weapon. When insulted, he did not shout. When dismissed, he did not beg. He let results speak. His patience built credibility. His discipline created trust. Slowly, doors that were closed began to open, and people who had once overlooked him were forced to notice the man they had ignored. He rose without spectacle. He never boasted, never demanded credit. He built teams, inspired loyalty, and gave back to the same communities that once struggled beside him. And with each success, he remembered the nights in the library, the corners of the street, the cracked voice of a grandmother who knew the power of quiet strength. Now, sitting in the boardroom accused of being unqualified, Marcus was not shaken. He had faced sharper judgments in places where nothing was handed freely. His silence was not fear. It was the same silence that had carried him from street corners to skyscrapers. The board could not see it yet. But every calm breath, every steady gaze carried the story of battles fought and won, long before this moment. Linda Carter's arrogance was loud, but Marcus's history was louder, though it spoke in silence. He remembered his grandmother's final warning, words that echoed across decades, words that had shaped him into the man who now sat, unflinching, at the center of power, close. Never let them mistake your silence for weakness. The sound of heels struck the floor like a drumbeat of control. Linda Carter's sharp steps echoed through the boardroom, as if each strike of her heel could carve authority into the polished marble. Papers in her hand shook not with fear, but with a show of force. waving like banners of accusation. Her voice sliced through the stillness. "This board cannot afford mistakes," she declared, "and we cannot afford men who are unqualified." The word hung in the air like smoke, pointed, heavy, aimed directly at Marcus Johnson. The directors shifted in their chairs. Some cleared their throats. Others looked down, unwilling to be caught between confrontation and truth. Marcus did not flinch. His hands remained folded neatly on the table, his gaze steady, calm as a lake in the early morning. The contrast between them was striking, her noise against his silence, her agitation against his composure. Linda tapped the stack of papers against the table, the sound sharp, impatient. "I have documents here. Records, reports, details you all should see. This man has no business making decisions that affect billions. If we allow this, we risk lawsuits, shareholder revolt, and complete collapse of trust." She placed the papers in the center of the table with a flourish, as if the gesture itself was proof. The glass surface reflected the stack. 2 images of the same accusation, one real and one hollow. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at Marcus. "If you had any respect for this company, you would leave quietly. Don't force us to take legal action. Don't embarrass yourself further." The directors avoided his eyes. A pen clicked nervously. The clock ticked on, louder than before. The silence that followed her threat was not agreement, but fear. Fear of siding with the wrong voice. Fear of standing too close to truth. Marcus stayed still, his breath even, his gaze steady. For Linda, stillness looked like surrender, and so she pressed harder. "Unqualified," she repeated, slower this time, letting the word echo against glass and leather. "You may fool some people with calm looks and quiet words, but you cannot fool me. I know what's at stake, and I won't let this board be dragged down because of one man who doesn't belong." Her voice rose with every sentence, but the louder she grew, the smaller she seemed. Her anger filled the room, but it could not bend the man seated before her. Symbolism filled the scene. The papers she waved like weapons were only ink and assumption. The heels that struck the floor so boldly carried her closer to the edge of overreach. And across from her, Marcus's stillness became a mirror, reflecting her noise back to her, exposing the imbalance between arrogance and strength. The tension swelled. Every director felt it. The glass walls, the polished table, the bright city skyline beyond, all seemed to lean toward the man who had yet to speak. The suspense was unbearable. Then, with the slow grace of someone who controlled his own timing, Marcus shifted. He leaned forward. His hands moved at last, folding the papers she had pushed toward him. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice, but the very act of leaning forward silenced the room more than any shout could have done. Close. Marcus finally leaned forward to speak. The silence cracked when Marcus finally spoke. His voice was steady, low, and unshaken, yet it carried across the boardroom like a bell in an empty hall. "You keep calling me unqualified," he said, eyes fixed on Linda Carter. "But perhaps it's time you know who I am." The words landed heavier than the papers she had waved moments earlier. Chairs creaked as directors leaned forward, their attention pulled tight to him. Even the ticking clock seemed to pause, waiting. Marcus did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority was woven into every syllable. "I am not here as an advisor. I am not here as a guest. I am the chief architect of the company you sit in, the one who built this empire from nothing. The systems you rely on, the networks, the markets, the strategies, they bear my name. They are my design. I am not only your CEO, I am the owner of this industry itself." The weight of his words shifted the atmosphere. It was no longer Linda's show of force pressing on the room. It was the quiet strength of truth that pressed back. For a moment, no one moved. The polished glass table reflected Marcus's face like a second mirror of authority, doubling his presence. The city skyline beyond the glass no longer looked distant. It looked conquered, as if his words had claimed it. The contrast was undeniable. Linda had stood tall, waving accusations like weapons, certain her titles and confidence could define reality. Now her posture faltered. The power she tried to wield dissolved the instant Marcus revealed the scale of his. A director coughed nervously, then fell silent again. Another lowered his pen, realizing the notes he had been taking no longer mattered. Around the table, The illusion that Linda controlled the room evaporated. Marcus had not shouted her down. He had simply told the truth, and the truth dwarfed everything else. Linda's face stiffened. She opened her mouth, searching for a reply, but none came. Her arguments, rehearsed and sharp, meant nothing against the plain revelation that the man she tried to push aside was the very foundation she stood on. Marcus leaned back slightly, his calm presence expanding rather than shrinking. "You wanted me out," he continued. "Yet every contract you've signed, every deal you've celebrated, was made possible by the structures I created. Without me, there is no board to sit on. Without me, there is no company to protect. You call me unqualified? No, I am the qualification." Silence swallowed the room whole. No one could deny it. The truth was too large to argue, too solid to twist. It did not need defense. It stood on its own. Linda's hand trembled slightly as she clutched her pen. For the first time, the papers in her folder looked small, fragile against the scale of what Marcus had just revealed. She tried to hold her composure, but the tension betrayed her. The pen slipped from her hand, striking the marble table with a sharp, hollow clatter. The sound echoed like the collapse of an illusion. Close. A pen slipped from Linda's hand, clattering against marble. The clatter of Linda's pen had barely faded when Marcus slid a folder across the glass table. It was not thick, not dramatic in weight, but its presence carried more force than her shouted accusations. The directors leaned closer, their eyes drawn to the plain cover. Marcus's voice was measured, investigative in tone. "You wanted records, Linda. Let's look at them." He opened the folder and revealed pages stamped with signatures, dates, and board seals. "This is not about me," he continued. "This is about you. The record shows a pattern, one too consistent to be dismissed as error." He lifted the first sheet. 2 years ago, you blocked a qualified colleague from promotion. Your reason, written in your own words, was that he would not fit the image. His gaze stayed fixed on her. The image you meant had nothing to do with competence. It had everything to do with appearance. Linda shifted in her chair. "That's not—" Marcus did not raise his voice. He simply turned another page. "Here. Last year, 3 employees filed reports against you. Each claimed you created a hostile environment, questioning their place, doubting their credentials, dismissing their input before meetings even began." He paused. All 3 of those employees resigned within months. Their careers disrupted. Their voices silenced. The boardroom fell quiet. Only the soft hum of the city beyond the glass remained. The directors watched the evidence pile up. Linda's confidence, once loud, now weakened with every page turned. Marcus placed another document on the table, this one highlighted in red. And here, financial missteps. Authorizations you pushed through without full review. Contracts steered toward partners with personal ties. Decisions that weakened the company you claim to defend. He let the words settle. They did not need drama. The facts carried their own weight. The contrast was stark. Linda had waved papers filled with accusations against him, but those pages were built on assumption. Marcus presented documents of her own making, signed with her hand, stamped with official seals. Her weapons turned into mirrors, reflecting her actions back at her. A director whispered to another, the sound like wind through a crack in the wall. Another shifted in his seat, glancing from Marcus to Linda with new awareness. The silence was no longer on her side. Marcus leaned forward slightly, not in anger but in clarity. "You tried to paint me as unqualified, as someone who didn't belong. But the truth is simpler. You feared what my presence revealed. That power can be earned, not inherited. That leadership is measured in discipline, not noise. And that dignity exposes arrogance for what it is, fragile." Linda's jaw tightened. She reached for her papers, but her hand trembled. The stack she had once waved proudly now seemed thin, empty against the weight of his evidence. The symbolism was clear. Her pen had fallen. Her voice faltered. The very tools she relied on, accusations, authority, intimidation, collapsed under the weight of truth. Around the table, whispers spread. Some directors exchanged looks of concern. Others nodded faintly, already sensing where the balance was shifting. The power that had once seemed to rest with Linda was slipping, inch by inch, page by page. Marcus closed the folder with quiet finality. He did not shout. He did not gloat. He let silence finish the work. Close, the board whispered, and Linda realized her position was collapsing. The boardroom felt like a courtroom without a judge. Every eye was fixed on Linda Carter as she fumbled for words. The stack of papers that once gave her power now sat lifeless before her, exposed for what they were. Accusations without foundation. She cleared her throat, her voice breaking. This is being twisted. Those documents are out of context. They don't, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Where confidence had once thundered, hesitation now cracked. She raised her volume, trying to fill the room again, but the louder she spoke, the less conviction her words carried. Across from her, Marcus remained still. He had not touched the glass of water in front of him. It stood clear, unshaken, a silent symbol of the man himself. His posture never changed, his voice never rose. Conviction needed no performance. Context? He said finally, his tone steady, almost quiet. The context is your signature. The context is the careers you ended. The context is a pattern this company can no longer afford to ignore. The contrast was sharp. Her voice trembled, cracked, reached for defense. His voice was calm, precise, anchored. Where she fought to justify, he simply revealed. Directors shifted in their seats. Some whispered to each other, subtle nods passing around the table. One finally spoke aloud, voice firm. Marcus is right. The facts stand, another followed. This company was built on his vision. We've all benefited from it. It's time we recognize the truth. Linda shook her head, panic edging into her features. You're making a mistake. He's manipulating, but the room no longer bent to her. Authority had left her side. The board's silence weighed heavier than her words. The balance had shifted and everyone felt it. Marcus did not strike back. He did not humiliate her. He let her collapse under the weight of her own unraveling. His strength was not in domination, but in restraint. He allowed truth to do the work. The symbolic glass of water before him caught the light, clear and untouched, while Linda's own hand shook as she reached for her papers. The contrast was undeniable. His clarity against her blur, his calm against her unraveling storm. At last, Linda sank into her chair. Her words had lost their edge. The paper slid uselessly to the side. The silence that followed was not in her favor. It was the silence of verdict. Marcus's gaze swept across the board. He did not gloat, did not smile. He simply let the moment stand, because truth did not need applause. The directors nodded one by one. The decision was unspoken but absolute. The room now belonged to Marcus, not by force, not by intimidation, but by the quiet weight of undeniable fact. He looked down at the glass of water, still full, still clear, then raised his eyes once more. His words were simple, final, carrying the moral weight of the moment. Close. Truth does not shout. It endures. The boardroom was still heavy with silence, but the storm had passed. Linda Carter sat small in her chair, her papers scattered, her voice gone. The balance of power had shifted completely, yet Marcus Johnson did not rise in triumph. He did not demand her removal on the spot. He could have. The evidence was there. The board was with him, and her defense had crumbled. One command from him, and her career would have ended that very hour. But Marcus understood something deeper, that leadership was not measured by how quickly one could cut down an opponent, but by how carefully one chose to act. He folded his hands on the table, the same quiet gesture that had steadied him from the beginning. This company, he said, voice calm and firm, cannot stand on vengeance. It must stand on principle. What we do here will echo beyond this room. The directors listened closely. They expected a sentence of dismissal. Instead, Marcus spoke of accountability, not destruction. Linda Carter will face review through the company's formal process. He continued. Every claim, every document, every action will be examined by independent counsel. No shortcuts, no favoritism, no humiliation. Justice must be seen and justice must be fair. Some directors exchanged surprised glances. Others nodded, understanding the depth of his decision. This was not weakness, it was discipline. By refusing to act from anger, Marcus showed that the same strength that had carried him from broken streets to this polished tower would now guide the company forward. Linda looked down at her hands. For the first time, she realized she was not being destroyed by Marcus. She was being held to a higher standard than she had ever held herself. The dignity he offered in this moment was sharper than any dismissal. The symbolism in the room was clear. The glass of water before Marcus remained untouched, still full, its clarity unbroken. It mirrored the clarity of his choice, measured, principled, unshaken by the temptation of revenge. By contrast, Linda's pen, the same one that had clattered to the marble floor, lay abandoned beside her papers. It symbolized the collapse of power rooted in arrogance, replaced by a justice too steady to be shaken. Marcus ended the session with a final statement, his words carrying weight beyond the boardroom. This company cannot build its future on fear or arrogance. It will build on truth, accountability, and respect. That begins today, the directors nodded. Decisions would follow, investigations would proceed, but the path had already been set. As Marcus rose from his seat, the room understood what had just been shown. Power was not loud. Power was not cruel. True power was steady, principled, and unwilling to be pulled into the shadows of vengeance. He glanced once more at the glass of water, then turned to leave. In his silence, he carried the lesson that had shaped his entire life. Close. Leadership is not measured by the power to destroy, but by the courage to build. The echo of the boardroom battle had faded, but Marcus Johnson knew victory meant little if it ended with him alone. True change had to reach further, past glass towers and polished tables, into the very streets where his own journey began. He returned to the neighborhood that had once shaped him, where cracked sidewalks and narrow alleys carried memories of struggle and hope side by side. The youth center stood at the corner, paint-chipped, windows clouded but alive with voices. Inside, children and teenagers filled rows of worn chairs, their eyes wide with curiosity. Marcus did not arrive with cameras or headlines. He came quietly, dressed not as a corporate giant but as the boy he once had been, carrying only the weight of his story. The room stilled when he stepped to the front. "I want to tell you something," he began, his voice steady, the same calm tone that had silenced a boardroom of directors. "I was once where you are now. I sat in rooms like this, wondering if the world had a place for me. People doubted me. Some even told me I didn't belong." The audience leaned in. His words were not polished speeches. They were truths. He spoke of long nights under street lamps with borrowed books, of starting with crates on a corner, of facing voices that tried to reduce him to silence. Each detail was simple, but it carried weight. "But I also had someone who taught me something I never forgot," he continued. "My grandmother told me, never let them mistake your silence for weakness." The phrase hung in the air like a torch in the dark. It was the same phrase that had guided him through storms of doubt, the same truth that had steadied him against arrogance and attack. He looked across the young faces before him. Silence, when it holds dignity, is strength. Humility, when it carries truth, is power. Do not measure yourself by the noise of others. Measure yourself by the discipline you carry, the vision you protect, and the respect you show, even when others show you none. The contrast was vivid. The broken walls of the youth center against the strength of his words. The uncertainty in the faces of the young against the certainty in his voice. He did not bring them promises of ease. He brought them a path of endurance and dignity. One boy in the back, no older than 12, sat slouched at first, arms crossed, doubt written in his posture. But as Marcus's words filled the room, something shifted. The boy's shoulders straightened. His eyes lifted. He saw perhaps for the first time what was possible, not just in Marcus Johnson's victory, but in his own. Marcus ended not with triumph, but with legacy. Remember this: leadership is not about shouting the loudest or standing the tallest. Leadership is about carrying light into dark places. And you, all of you, are the future light. The room erupted in applause. But the truest victory was quiet, the spark that had lit in the boy's eyes. Close. A young boy in the audience straightened his posture, seeing what was possible.